Craig Martin earned his bachelor's degree in civil engineering from KU in 1972. He also holds an MBA from the University of Denver. Craig began his career, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, with Martin KU Construction Company in Wichita, so nearby. Actually, there's a lot of K-Staters down there at Martin KU. Yes, there are. Craig joined Jacobs in 1994 through the company's acquisition of CRS Serene and the International Group, where he served as a senior vice president for operations. Craig served as Jacobs' principal sales and marketing executive from 1995 to 2000. Craig became president of Jacobs and joined the board of directors in 2002 and was appointed chief executive officer in 2006. Since joining Jacobs, the company's revenue has grown from since Craig joined Jacobs, the company's revenues increased from $1.16 billion to over $12 billion. Founded in 1947, Jacobs has more than 50,000 employees operating in more than 25 countries. The company provides full spectrum support to industrial, commercial, and governmental clients across multiple markets. Services include scientific and specialty consulting alongside all aspects of engineering, construction, and operations and maintenance. Jacobs' markets include, there's a long list here, aerospace and defense, automotive and industrial, buildings, chemicals and polymers, consumer and forest products, energy, environmental programs, infrastructure, oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnology and refining. So it's now my great pleasure to invite Craig Martin to present the third annual Tiberti Lecture. Craig?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I have my first little drink of water here. I'm going to take about, 45 minutes for what I'm going to present, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depends on how fast I talk. And then I'd like to take questions from you. And so, if you have questions, they don't have to be on today's subject. It'd be nice if some of them are, but they don't have to be. But any questions you'd like, I will try to answer. There may be some questions I can't answer, and there may be questions I don't know the answer to, and I'll tell you if I can't or if I don't know. If I don't know, I'll go right ahead then and speculate. But we should be able to cover a wide variety of topics. Once I get started, I'm going to spend a lot of my time talking about what ethics and integrity is, how broad an issue it is for all of us as we go forward. I'm going to take some time to talk about not only big idea ethics issues, things that you commonly think of in this context, but maybe some smaller things that happen that we all need to be thoughtful about. I'm going to talk about why it happens and what we can do about it. So that pretty much will make up the lectures as I've got it planned out today. The first part of any presentation I make, any speech I give, is an ethical one, and that's safety. And so I want to start by having a discussion about safety and the ethics of safety now. So why is safety so important? Well, for me, it's important because of what you see on the screen. 2 of my employees were in the back of that taxi, and one of them did not survive. After 4 months in a coma, he died. I don't know what I could have done to have prevented this accident. The taxi had a flat tire, it pulled off the road, and that lorry that you see drove up on the vehicle from behind. At, as you can see, a pretty high rate of speed. But I don't know that there isn't something that I or one of our employees could have done that might have prevented this accident. And so it's deeply personal for me and for everyone in our organization that we not let these kinds of things happen. Here's how our industry, this statistical data that you see right here is for the companies in our industry, the engineering construction industry, and the owners who use us, who are the very best in the world at safety. And what you see there, that number represents the recordable incident frequency for those companies. And that measure is per 100 employees who has a doctor case, a treatable injury, right, per 100 employees per year. So if you look at those numbers, you can see down here at the end, 0.43, right? So that means less than one, about a half a person is injured in these companies on average for every 100 employees in a year. And you'd think that's pretty good, except that it represents millions of employees. And the real fact of the matter is that it is a horrific statistic about our industry. Last year, just in the United States alone, 4,400 people were killed in this business. 32 of those were engineers and architects. Killed, right? And fatalities are a relatively rare form of injury, fortunately. But if you think about that statistic, if you think about that sort of number, even though this trend is quite good, right, the fact of the matter is a lot of people are getting hurt. And for Jacobs, one of our challenges was we have been on this sort of trend for a really long time, and our safety's gotten better virtually every year for 20 years, but we're still hurting more people than we used to because we're a bigger company. So you could have a recordable frequency of 1 a few years ago in a 10,000 person company, and maybe 100 people had injuries, right? And now you can have a recordable injury of 1/10 in a 100,000 person company, and it's the same 100 people. And so that's just not acceptable. And to me, that is one of the fundamental ethical issues of our industry. And one of the fundamental ethical issues for our company is preventing injury to our employees, their families, and anyone else we can influence. Anyone else we can influence. And one of my challenges to you when you leave this room is to start to think about those issues. The young man who was killed in that taxi was 27 years old and had a brand new baby, right? I know you think you're immortal, but you're not. And if you don't think about these things now, you might not get to be as old as me. Maybe you don't want to get to be as old as me, but you might not get to be, and it's a choice you want to make. So I strongly encourage you to think about safety. Let me ask you this question. How many of you talk on a cell phone or text while you're driving? Just hold your hand up. This is an ethical question, so if this is not one you should lie about, right? So who didn't tell the truth just now? Hold up your hand. Well, it is something that, again, you think won't kill you, but it will. The young lady who was, wrong slide, I'll come back to that in a minute. The young lady who was driving that car was texting a friend, had a girlfriend in the car with her, and never saw that motorcycle coming. And needless to say, no one survived that crash. And you can't take it back. I know you see all the ads on television, you hear all the stories, and you can't take it back. So I strongly encourage you. At Jacobs, it's against policy to use your cell phones when driving, even hands-free cell phones. There was a study done in the UK where they had a group of people drive a course where they surprised them with hazards. They had several groups. One group was normal, nothing. One group was legally drunk. One group was talking on a handheld cell phone. And one group was talking on a hands-free setup. Now, the best performing group turned out to be the ones who weren't on the phone and weren't drunk, right? But guess who the second best performing group was? The drunks. It's hard to understand how distracting that can be. And I've heard lots of people compare that discussion to I talked to somebody in the car with me, and that doesn't result in more accidents. Maybe it does. I haven't seen any statistics that suggest it does. But the person who's in the car with you is also aware of what's going on around you. The person you're talking to on the cell phone is not. And I think that makes a very significant difference in terms of where your concentration goes in the event of something surprising. So let me go back one, if it'll go back. There it is. This is something I would like you to watch. This is a video that we developed. It's up on YouTube. And it's called Kate's Story. And it's a video done by one of our employees, Kate Carpenter in the UK, whose husband, also one of our employees, was killed in an accident back in 2008. And she talks about that experience, what it was like, what it has done to her and her family. And it is, in my view, very, very powerful, emotionally gripping experience. I see Caitlin nodding her head. I think you've probably seen it, yeah? Yeah. And it, to me at least, it brings home to all of us who don't spend time out on job sites necessarily just how important this stuff can be and just what the consequences can be like if you don't do the right thing. So please, please, let's do the right thing. So that's safety. So I know I just went through that discussion, but here's what I worry will happen. I've always liked this quote. You'll all have a chance to decide for yourselves whether what we talked about the last couple minutes is useful or valuable or not. But I sure hope you go about changing behavior if you need to, rather than convincing yourself you don't need to change behavior because you're somehow different. Okay? Okay. So let's talk about ethics and integrity at work, right? Because I think that's the best context for the discussion that I would like to have with all of you. And let me start with the one that most people think of about ethics first, and it's bribery and corruption. This graphic is a graphic of all of the countries in the world that are surveyed by a company called Transparency International. And Transparency International goes out, surveys these countries, and develops an index for each country of how corrupt it is in the public sector, right? And it ranges from not very corrupt, which is the very light yellow color, like New Zealand, to extremely corrupt, which is kind of that dark rusty brown color, on this scale that you see in the lower corner. I want you to notice that in terms of corruption, the United States is not light yellow. It's not even medium yellow, it's moving toward dark yellow. The United States gets a corruption index score of 73 out of 100. So don't think that that kind of corruption in the public sector doesn't happen here. So even if your plans aren't to go to India or Kazakhstan or Iran, where those dark colors are, right? If your plan is to spend your career here in the United States, you're still going to face various forms of corruption. And part of your challenge will be to have thought through, and we'll go over this again at the end, who you are and what your beliefs about those things will be. Classic examples of this kind of corruption in the U.S. are things like pay to play. Are any familiar with the play to pay scandals? A few people, right? It's where companies like ours are asked to make donations, political donations, charitable donations, to favored charities of government officials in exchange for business. And it has been fairly common practice in a number of countries and not countries, but states and counties and cities for that sort of corruption to exist. Out in Los Angeles, where I live, the airport got involved in exactly that kind of a program where airport contractors were asked to make a political donation to a campaign that was sponsored by the mayor, and were told if they didn't make the donation, they wouldn't get any work at the airport. That ended up being a one-term mayor, and the director of the airports who did the bagman work there got fired. But the fact of the matter is that's not unusual. There are agencies in the U.S. for whom Jacobs cannot work because they have pay-to-play kinds of policies. So don't think you won't be faced with those kinds of issues. I'm not sure where change comes. Did I get it? Okay, yeah. And there's lots of big companies involved, huh? These are the companies as of March of 2013 who are being investigated by the Justice Department for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. And there's a lot of names on that list you know. And for the most part, I don't think those companies are necessarily corrupt companies. I don't think they're necessarily bad actors. But they've allowed something to happen, either in spite of their efforts or for lack of their efforts, I can't tell you that either, that has resulted in them being considered to be possibly in violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Interesting, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act does not apply to corruption in the United States, which is a real interesting fact about a lot of countries who prohibit bribery. They prohibit bribery to their officials, but they don't prohibit bribery to other countries' officials. Now that's changing. The UK has put in place a Bribery Act now that's every bit as challenging and specific as our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it covers everything including the UK. If you have an office in the UK, if you do work in the UK, you're covered by the Act whether your headquarters is in the UK or not. But it's a clear problem, and it is something that you might easily face at some point in your career, particularly as you go out and about and start to interface with customers, and particularly as you work in some of these places where the corruption problems are so severe. It's a real challenge. But it's not the only one. So you've got this bribery and corruption kind of issue, but you've also got procurement integrity, right? Let me advance my notes here, which is also a factor. Right? Now, what is procurement integrity or conflicts of interest? You know, that's when you provide something for someone who can make a decision, for example, about whether or not you get work. So the pay-to-play discussion that I had a minute ago is a form of violation of procurement integrity, right? There are other violations of those kinds of things that can happen pretty easily. For example, we were working on a big project in Texas, and we had our team, plus we had a bunch of subcontractors working on our team, and we were in competition with several other companies for this big job. And we had sent in our proposals, and we were in the process of preparing for the orals presentation. And our subcontractor walked in the room with a box. And he set the box on the table and opened it up and said, "Here are all the other proposals." So this person had gone to the customers, had a friend in the customer's organization, and gotten copies of all the proposals for all of our competitors on this big job. Now I'm really pleased with what our folks did. They put the lid back on the box. They sent the guy out of the room with the box. They called the customer and told the customer what had happened and offered to withdraw from the bidding, right? Because once you're tainted, right, how do you go backward? Now, you always hope when you make that offer, the customer is saying, no, you did the right thing, we'll leave you in the competition, but they never do, right? Because they don't want to have to justify what happened to anyone else, so they always accept your offer to withdraw. And so you're hurt, right? But that's sort of fundamental to whether you're going to be an ethical company or not. You know, you've got to accept the consequences of being ethical, even when they're undeserved. Let alone when you're not bribing somebody and therefore don't get work. But when you do the right thing, sometimes you're going to get punished for it. And you have to decide if that's what you're going to be and who you're going to be as you go forward. The example I have here on the screen is a fairly famous one about Boeing. Now, I don't think Boeing's a bad company, but Boeing's CFO got involved in recruiting a woman to be on their team in a leadership role. That woman happened to be in charge of the procurement of the replacement aircraft for the tanker fueling program. Now, we do a lot of government work, and we knew this woman very well. And I would tell you that at the time this came out, we were shocked because she enjoyed a marvelous reputation for having done the right thing and for her integrity in the industry. And yet, whether she was thoughtful about it or not thoughtful about it, She was in job negotiations with Boeing at the same time she was awarding them a $13 billion contract. And you can see what the consequences of that were. It cost the CFO his job, it cost the CEO his job, the CFO went to jail, she went to jail, and no matter what you think, even the country club jails, we build them, you don't want to be there. You may take that to the bank. These are not nice places. If you have any doubt, you'll see another memorable case here in a minute. You can watch her video of what it was like to be in a country club prison. I won't show it to you, but it's available on the web. But just the whole business of conflicts of interest and procurement integrity are critical, right? And it's what the easiest thing to do is to disclose it. I mean, this is one of those places where you just tell people what's going on and you can figure out what to do. I'll give you another example from inside Jacobs. We had an employee who was buying office supplies for the project from the spouse. Spouse had an office supply store. The employee was buying office supplies from that spouse. And we have an integrity hotline, and we got a call from somebody said, this is going on, you need to look into it. And we went and looked into it, and in fact, that's exactly what was happening. So that's not good, is it? Now, it turns out that this particular project's about 400 miles from any other city, and there's only one supplier of office supplies in the city it's near, and that's the spouse. And when we looked at what was being paid for the office supplies, it was entirely reasonable. We weren't getting overcharged, we weren't paying for things we weren't getting. Everything was on the up and up, but it's still wrong. What could she have done? Call somebody. Say, I need to buy office supplies and the only supplier is my husband. And we could have worked it out. We could have had one of our other offices or buy and order the supplies for that project rather than her doing it directly. And we could have eliminated the conflict. But no disclosure creates a problem. The lady in the picture could, I think, easily have said, look, I'm in negotiations with Boeing for a job. I can't be involved in this procurement. And that would have taken care of the problem. Or the reverse. She could have said to Boeing, I'd love to consider working there, but we're in the middle of a procurement. We can't have this conversation. Go away. That would have worked too. And the fact, I think, that she thought of herself as of such high integrity, and in fact, probably the fact that it didn't influence her thinking at all, had nothing to do with it. Because it doesn't matter whether she did it with all the right reasons, and if she maintained her integrity completely, looks bad. And one of the things that's important about ethics is understanding not only whether it's right or wrong, but also how it looks. You know, when we talk about these things in our training sessions at Jacobs, we often talk about the question of what would you say if it showed up on the front page of the newspaper? How would you feel about your mom or your dad or your sister or brother reading about that? And if you wouldn't feel good about it, you probably ought not to do it. Or at the very least, you ought to get some advice. So that's procurement integrity. And then there's something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is project ethics. Now, what would you guess project ethics is about? Running a project, executing work, right? And where are the ethical decisions in running a project? I mean, you got something you're trying to design or build, and you just get out there and design it or build it. But projects, as you know, are not that simple. The design process is not that simple. There's ample opportunity to either cut corners or make decisions that are inappropriate. There's the National Society of Professional Engineers fundamental canons. And look at the words that I've highlighted for you in red, and in particular the last one, honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully. All of those things. And lawful doesn't cover a lot of issues that you're going to face. An example that we see in our industry all the time Customer comes to us and says, I've got this project, and I've got $100 million to do it. And I need it done by the end of into next year, let's say. So we'd like you to take a look at it, give us a proposal. And so you give the customer a proposal, only when you look at the project, you know it's going to cost $150 million to build, and it can't be done in what would be 15 months. It's going to take 24 months to build, design and build. And the customer comes back and says, if it's going to cost that much and take that long, we don't have a project. Right? So right now you know that the project shouldn't be done at that higher price and with that longer schedule because it doesn't make sense for the customer. But of course the customer's probably got a job that depends on being able to do this project. If the project doesn't get done, the customer doesn't have a job. And of course you got 50 or 60 of your friends, people you go home back and forth to work with every day, right, who might get laid off if you don't get this project because there won't be work for them. So what do? That's the risk, right? That's exactly the risk. That someone will decide, well, okay, we'll go ahead and say it's $100 million, and we'll go ahead and say it'll get done in 15 months, and it'll take what it takes, and it'll cost what it costs. And the customer gets a bad project, and you get a bad reputation. Or maybe it's more subtle than that. Value engineering. Now, value engineering is great stuff when it genuinely takes scope or adds value to a project. But often what we see is it's a fantasy. A bunch of stuff gets value engineered out so we can all agree it's a $100 million project, and in the first month of the project it gets put back in. Or the savings that those value engineering ideas were going to create aren't really as good as everybody wanted them to be. Right? But there's the conundrum, right? There's the question that you have to face is what are you going to do in that situation? Are you going to tell the truth? Are you going to be honest with the customer? Are you going to stand up tall and say, this is a $150 million project. Yeah, there's $10 million worth of value engineering here that's real, but there's not 50. And if it doesn't make sense at $150 million, you shouldn't do it. And then you got to go home and go back to the office and tell all those people that you lost the work. And generally what happens is somewhere in this discussion with the customer says, company XYZ, one of your competitors, says they can do it for $100 million. Why can't you? But if you've done a gut check and you know it's a $150 million project, then you know what that other competitor's doing. And are you going to go along with that? Are you going to be me too? Or are you going to do the right thing? Those kinds of ethical decisions you will face very quickly in your career in this business. And you need to know where you stand. You need to know where your company stands, whoever you go to work for, on issues like that one. I was talking with Stan earlier about, where should ethics be in the curriculum? And Stan made the point it should be in everything, every course, every element of what you learn while you're here should have an element of ethics. And I believe that's 100% true. Because I think there are so many more things that we face that could be potentially ethically significant than we realize from taking a 3-hour course on ethics or reading a good book about ethics, if there are such things. I mean, it's a pretty dry topic when you think about it. It's got to be in the fabric of what you do and how you think about what you do. So that's project ethics. And then there's another ethical issue, and that's real fundamental: lying, cheating, and stealing. Right? There's our poster child. It's very interesting. I've talked to a number of lawyers who tell me that, in fact, Martha Stewart was probably not guilty of insider trading and did not have to go to jail. She went to jail for obstruction of justice, lying. She lied to the investigators. Right? She thought she'd done something wrong, or she thought she might have done something wrong, And so she was driven to lie about it, and it turned out the lie was the wrong thing, for sure, and it's unlikely what she thought she'd done wrong was actually wrong. Another really challenging issue. Why do people lie? Why do they violate their personal integrity in situations like this one, or in just day-to-day situations at the office, or at home for that matter? I think it's a question that, again, bears some serious thought, because we've seen employees lie about things, and invariably, at a minimum, when you find out, it costs you your job. And sometimes it can cost you your career. And for what? So, that's Martha. And here's something interesting. You don't really need to see the details, just the colors, although you're welcome to try if your eyesight's good enough. The Ethics Research Council did a survey, and they focused on people who are active in social networking, and they asked those people whether they were very active or just somewhat active. They asked them some ethical questions, and then they broke down by age who answered that question in a way that suggests they would behave unethically, right? And if you see there, the group that was most likely to answer the question and say they would be unethical are millennials, people your age, 18 to 29. Now, they haven't figured out why that would be true, right? But in fact, almost double what you see in the green areas for the same question when put to other folks who have things, they were trying to understand what the impact of social networking was. They weren't looking for this answer, but they got it. And I find that surprising that they would got that. I actually would have expected the opposite, right? I actually thought the data would suggest that millennials are less prone rather than more prone. So there's clearly some challenges out there in terms of the way in which people think about it. So why does it happen? Everybody recognize what that is? Yeah, Challenger. It happens for some of the reasons we've already talked about. People do it for greed, right? People behave unethically for reasons of greed. People behave unethically for reasons for power, right? For success. We've just described people who do it for reasons of fear. They're just afraid to do the right thing. And you find people who do it because they think they're doing a good thing. They're trying to be efficient. Classic example, one we have not faced yet at Jacobs and hope we won't face, is the business of bribing a customs officer to get material or equipment or visas or whatever you happen to need to get into a country. It is not at all unusual to be asked for modest bribes by U.S. income standards to get something through customs or to get a visa for one of your people to come into the country. Right? And one of my big concerns for us at Jacobs is that we'll have that problem. That someone will decide entirely out of the goodness of their heart, right, to help us be successful as a company, they'll pay that bribe. Or several of them. When I talk about ethics inside our organization, I talk a lot about a death by 1,000 cuts. I know with certainty that our CEO won't be caught in a bribery scandal. Okay, I can be confident of that. I know that guy pretty well. And I'm pretty confident of our leadership team that they won't be caught in that kind of a scandal. But I can see where one of those 65,000 people that are out there working for us today could make a mistake thinking they're doing the right thing for the company. And that's part of why I come back to Stan's comment about ethics has to be in everything you do. And we do just what Stan's described. There isn't a training course in Jacobs that you can get that doesn't have an ethics module in it. You can't talk about it enough. We just completed what's called our annual business meeting. And I had our chairman come in and spend an hour talking about ethics and what it meant. And we went through a lot of these same kinds of issues. We talked about bribery and corruption, but we got to the project ethics conversation pretty quick, because that really brings it home. So many people in that room, probably a little less than half of them were from the U.S., don't think they'll ever be faced with a bribery or kind of a problem. But many of them will be faced with other kinds of ethical issues, and all of them, sooner or later, will be faced with the project ethics issue. So it's up to them. So that's one reason people do it, and one of the things I think you have to focus on to prevent it from happening, right? Another reason people do it is because the company is corrupt culturally, right? Or because the world in which they grew up doesn't believe that corruption is necessarily wrong. So you can have national cultures that think that some forms of ethical breaches are okay, like paying bribes. And you can have company cultures where the ethics are questionable, and I think Enron is an example of one of those that most all of us know about, where the culture is corrupt. But a lot of this comes from what happened here. And it's what I call, what I think the industry now calls, conformity bias. I happen to have a guy who works for us who was working for a different company at the time and was in the room when the Thiokol engineers authorized the flight of this aircraft. And he watched the discussion back and forth between NASA and Thiokol. And he watched the discussion focus not on what the risks were and why not to fly, but why not fly, if you understand the distinction I'm trying to make. It was, can you say for sure that we shouldn't fly? And they couldn't do that. No one could say with absolute certainty that if you fly, this bad thing will happen. And over a period of several hours, the conversation went from, we're afraid of this, we think it's a significant risk, this could be a problem, to, can you absolutely say for sure it shouldn't fly? And ultimately, the Thiokol engineers gave the go-ahead. And it was interesting when you talked to this guy that was there and listened to him talk about how that, over time, that built up and people all sort of converged together on what we now know was the wrong answer. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we see when we look at ethics issues, is the tendency of people to believe it's okay because others are doing it, or to come to a common view about something that's different than the right view. One of the interesting things about that same ERC study that you just saw is they asked this same group of people how many of them had seen an ethics violation in the workplace. And many of them had, half in some cases. Then they asked them, did you report it? Only 2/3 of the people who had seen a violation reported it. For all kinds of reasons. I don't want to make waves. I don't want to get yelled at by my peers. I don't want to be a rat. You get all kinds of reasons why people chose not to do the right thing. And it's all around that business of wanting to be in conformity, wanting to be part of the group, not wanting to stand out. Because when you're making an ethical decision, particularly if you're going to report out on it, you're going to stand out. And again, I think that's one of the challenges that as a group, and individuals, we all face going forward. So, we got a pretty good idea why it happens. And obviously it isn't getting reported like it should. One of the things the survey did was ask people in these various age groups, what would you need if you were, to feel comfortable to report a violation. And interestingly, the answer that the millennials gave, your age group, had three key points in it. Point number one, they had to feel like they were prepared to deal with the decision. That they understood what the issues were and they were prepared with how to deal with this ethical decision. Two, they had to rely on their coworkers. They tended to rely on their coworkers to give them advice about what to do. That was the second important thing. Now, interestingly, when we talk about conformity bias, where does conformity bias start coming in that discussion? It starts right there, right? You start consulting with your friends and they start saying, look, don't make waves. You don't want that kind of visibility. What happens? It doesn't get reported. That's pretty terrible, right? And then the third thing that millennials wanted was they wanted somebody in the company to talk to. Now, most good companies these days have somebody like that, a chief ethics and compliance officer or someone who's designated specifically to deal with ethical questions. But having somebody to talk to about that who isn't in your chain of command, so to speak, is pretty valuable. And if you find yourself in one of these situations someday, use that resource if the company has it. If the company doesn't have that resource, I'd usually go to the general counsel, whoever the chief lawyer in the company is. That's not as good as an ethics and compliance officer, but at least you're getting out of the chain of command, you're getting advice from somebody who can help. Now, doing that in some cases means you've already reported it. But having somebody to go to can be helpful. It's interesting, baby boomers had a little different view in terms of what was important. They wanted to know that they were being encouraged to report violations. So the boomers have a different concern about whether they do or don't report when they see something bad. And that was really the principal issue for them. And they also wanted a company that rewards ethical behavior. So what do you do? What are the things that you can do to be able to say to yourself, to look in the mirror every night and say, I was ethical today. There's obviously the things, power and greed, and you've got to decide if you're that kind of person. You've got to get over fear if you find yourself in that situation. And you've got to be sure that what the company wants from you is efficiency at the expense of ethicality, right? But those are decisions you can ask yourself. And almost all companies these days, certainly public companies like Jacobs, have a code of conduct. And in fact, nowadays they post it on their website. It's a requirement of the Sarbanes-Oxley that you post your code of conduct. So you can go and look at the code of conduct for almost any company, any public company at least, that you might be considering going to work for, or that you might be working for. You can go see what their code of conduct says. And ours is there. I like ours. We just finished another revision, and we went from what I would characterize as a prescriptive code of conduct, looked like it was written by me. It was actually. To one that's more behavioral, more conceptual in terms of right and wrong. And I like this new one better. But I think what you ought to do is have your own code of conduct. I think you ought to take the time to write down or otherwise, in your own mind, decide where you stand on what's right and what's wrong. And anytime you find yourself in an ethical situation, anytime you feel like you're challenged to do the right thing, you've got that code of conduct to go back to. But you want to create that code of conduct when you don't have the problem, whatever that problem may turn out to be. You want to create that code of conduct now, so you can be thoughtful and objective about what it is you really want to be and who you really want to be and how you really want to behave. And I believe if you do that, when you get faced with that tough decision, you'll do the right thing. The other thing you can do is, when we talked about conformity bias, you can be the friend who gives the right advice. You could be the one, when somebody comes to you with a problem, can say, no, you got to report this. You got to do the right thing. Don't do that. Don't let somebody ask you to do that. Don't be involved in that. Because if in fact you're going to tend to look for advice from people you know, from your friends in the organization, then you need to be somebody who can be counted on to give good advice when somebody comes to you. It's interesting, we characterize Jacobs as a network company. And we say that not because of technology, but because we really work hard to try to create connections directly between the people who work in the company. When we have meetings, we have big chunks of white space. If you were to come to our annual business meeting, the first thing I would tell you as I kicked off the meeting is don't sit at any table where you know someone. Right? That's the way we want you to learn more about the company and get more friends and build a bigger network in Jacobs, because that's how things get done here. The network gets things done. Well, going back to my conversation earlier about a death by 1,000 cuts, that worries me as well. I think it's a great way to run a company. It takes a lot less overhead to do that, takes a lot less structure to do that, but you have to be confident that people are going to do the right thing and that they will advise each other to do the right thing. So this conversation is one we have a lot when we talk about the company. But I believe that you can make a difference, and I believe that your generation has the ability to make a difference if they choose to do so. But it is an individual choice. If it's going to happen, it's up to each one of you as an individual. You can't look around at somebody else and make it their problem. I'll do my part, but I can only do my part. I can't do your part for you. You have to do your part. But I believe if you do, we can go a long way toward a more ethical world and a more ethical environment for companies like ours and like the ones that you will join when you leave here. That's the end of my prepared remarks. And so I'd be glad now to take some questions. Again, I really like questions. I like hard questions. I don't mind at all squirming a little bit. So please, does anyone have a question? Back in the back there.
When you create a culture of safety within your own company, how do you extend that to the subcontractors that may work with you one day in a different company the next, so that those people that you're still responsible for can apply the same principles that you have in the company?
That's one of the big challenges that we have taken on, is trying to do exactly that. So we have, our safety program is called Beyond Zero. And the concept for it was built on the idea, and I should have repeated the question. Let me do that before I go further. The question was, how do we get our safety culture moved down into subcontractors and others that work on sites where we are, that can affect both our own employee safety and theirs, particularly as they move from different job sites. So we took on this Beyond Zero program back in 2007. And the idea of Beyond Zero is just what it sounds like. It's something more than just zero incidents and zero injuries. And we didn't know what more would look like. We still don't know what more will look like. I mean, it has something to do with being healthy. It has something to do with keeping all the families and loved ones of our employees safe. It has something to do with how we treat our subs and what our expectations are. So it has to do with all those things. And the concept came from distance runners and sprinters, for that matter. And if you remember, if you've ever run, anybody track and field person here? Should be some good ones at Kansas, I think. When you run you don't run to the finish line, right? You run past it. Because otherwise you got to subconsciously slow down. Well, that's what we decided we needed to think about zero incidents and injuries. If we just tried to get to zero, we'd end up with a curve that looks like that one up there, where we got closer, but we never got there. When we started thinking about going beyond zero, then we could do something special, something different. Where that goes with the subcontractor community is, first of all, we require that the subs be first judged on their safety statistics in terms of, do they have a basic safety program? Are they getting acceptable, if not great results, but acceptable results, or they just not care? And the ones that just don't care, we don't employ them. So they don't get on our job sites if we can help it. Sometimes we are forced to use them, but if we can help it. Once they're on a job site with Jacobs, it's our house, our rules. And so we expect the subs to behave according to the same rules, the same standards, the same behaviors that we as a company have. And for the most part, they're willing to do that. There are still a few subcontractors out there who think safety and productivity are opposed, but the statistics, the facts, the research all says just the opposite. Safer is more productive. And we do a pretty good job of being able to make that happen. We have one of the best results from the subcontractor community. Their safety results when they're on a Jacobs job are statistically better, and when we've had outside auditors look at this, are statistically better than our industry, the industries that they work in, and their own safety records when they're on other than Jacobs jobs. So we're making progress. But it really is about job owning, it's about eye to eye, it's about caring. An awful lot of what makes for great safety results is whether or not you care, whether there's an emotional connection. Interesting story, we had 2 sites. So we're the construction manager for an owner, and we're basically doing just a kind of clerk of the works kind of work, just sort of very high level supervision of these 2 sites. One of the sites has absolutely terrible safety, and one of them has absolutely great safety. And it's 2 identical projects in 2 different locations that are otherwise completely similar. They're being run by the same company, and the 2 leaders of the project, the 2 superintendents who are doing the projects, are twin brothers, identical twins. All right? Now, what in the world accounts for the difference in the safety performance? Why is one twin brother getting the results he's getting, and the other dismal results? And we went to the sites, and we audited them, and we talked to people, and we tried to find out what was going on, and we almost went away still scratching our heads. And then we found out that on the safe site, that superintendent's son was an apprentice. And he wasn't going to go home to his wife and tell her that his child got hurt on his project. That was the difference. That bit of caring was the difference. And we were just lucky to find that out. But it matters, right? People know when you care. And part of why I think so powerful about the Kate video that I talked about, Kate's story, is you can't not care after you, at least I can't not care. I've seen it 22 times and I still cry. And so you can't not care. And when it gets personal, when it's intensely personal to you, it starts to really matter. Great question. Thank you very much. Did I answer it?
Yeah, thanks.
We have time for one more.
One more question. Obviously, I overran my 45 minutes. Anybody? Over here.
You do work in almost every country or every continent with Antarctica. How do ethics change across cultures? And if so, do different cultures sometimes cause you to make decisions that you might deem unethical in America?
There's clearly differences in cultures as you go across the globe, and some cultures have a higher acceptance of things that we think are corrupt or unethical. Bribery is probably the most common one, and there are a number of countries where that's considered a normal way to supplement your income. You're expected to charge 5 rupees in India to get a piece of paper processed because they don't pay the clerk enough to live on, and that's how the clerk gets paid for processing that form. We take the position that doesn't matter, we don't do that. And it causes us some trouble sometimes, quite honestly. We had a customer at one of our job sites who couldn't get the electricity turned on. Got the plant built, can't get power, right? And they kept coming to us and saying, well, go fix this. You go get the power turned on. We said, right? Because we know what's holding up the power, and we're not going to be a part of that. Now, it really made the customer unhappy with us, right? So the customer didn't want to do it themselves. They wanted us to do it for them. And we had to say no. That was the last job we got for that customer, by the way. They'll come back eventually. But that's what you have to say, right? You have to be willing to say, we're not going to do that, and if it causes us a problem, we're going to quit. We bought a company in one of these countries a few years ago, and we learned after we bought the company that they had been taking bribes on construction sites for looking the other way when there was less rebar than was supposed to be in there, or or some quantities were shorted, or pier links were a little short. So first thing we did was we fired all those people that did that. That was easy. Then we went and looked at how could we prevent this from happening. And when we really looked at it, the conclusion we reached is we can't. So we got out of the business. We just stopped doing it. And I find for us, a lot of times the best way to avoid being put in that situation and in a place where that's expected is not to put yourself in the position of doing the kind of work where it's expected. So when we're asked to go to a country and we're buying equipment, first question I ask is, who's responsible for getting it in the country? Because we don't want that responsibility, because once that responsibility is ours, you may not be able to do it without paying bribes, and I'm not putting our people in that position. So somebody else has to go deal with that. We won't subcontract it either, because that's same issue, right? So that is a challenge, and that's one of those places where I think all of you and all of us at Jacobs have to think hard about where do we stand on this issue of ethics and on the issue of corruption in particular, because there are going to be lots of things you just can't do and do them ethically. And your choice is to do them unethically or not do them. Okay? Thank you all very much.